You can tell a lot about a family by who they laugh at during Christmas dinner. I didn't know that truth until the night my own children laughed at the man I loved. The snow had been falling all afternoon, the kind that makes the whole neighborhood look like a Christmas card, soft white covering the lawns and rooftops of our quiet Ohio suburb. I remember sitting in the passenger seat of Jack's old pickup truck, watching the warm lights glowing through my son's dining room window, and telling myself everything would be fine. Christmas was supposed to be about forgiveness, about family coming together no matter what had happened before. That was the hope I carried with me when I stepped out of that truck. I was 67 years old, and I had lived long enough to know families could be complicated, but I still believed love could smooth the rough edges. Jack walked around the truck to open my door like he always did, his work-worn hands careful and gentle. "Ready?" he asked with that quiet smile of his. Jack Bennett wasn't the kind of man people noticed right away. He dressed simply, usually in clean but faded work shirts, and his hands were rough from years of honest labor. He worked as a janitor at a local high school, and he was proud of it. He believed every job done with dignity mattered. That was one of the many reasons I loved him. But I also knew my ex-husband, Daniel, and the rest of my family didn't see the world the same way. As we walked up the short brick path to my son Ryan's front door, I could already hear the noise of dinner inside. Laughter, silverware clinking against plates, the low hum of a crowded room. Ryan hosted Christmas every year now. His house was bigger than the one I had raised him in, with high ceilings and a dining table that could seat 12. I had helped pay for his college once, back when things between us still felt simple. The door swung open before we even knocked. My daughter-in-law, Emily, stood there with a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Merry Christmas," she said, stepping aside so we could enter. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon filled the air. Across the living room, I spotted Daniel standing near the fireplace, drink in hand, already surrounded by a small audience the way he liked it. Some habits never change, even after 20 years of divorce. Ryan came over and hugged me quickly, the kind of hug people give when they feel obligated. Then his eyes shifted to Jack. "And you must be Jack," he said. Jack extended his hand with that same calm smile. "Nice to finally meet you, Ryan." For a moment, everything seemed polite enough. Coats were hung, chairs pulled out, plates passed around the table. 12 people sat down under the warm glow of the chandelier, while snow kept falling outside the window. I remember thinking maybe I had worried for nothing. Maybe this Christmas could be peaceful after all. But family dinners have a way of revealing what people really think, and it only takes one question to start everything unraveling. Daniel leaned back in his chair, swirling the ice in his glass, studying Jack like a man inspecting something he wasn't sure belonged at the table. Then he smiled the same old smile I remembered from years ago and asked the question that changed the entire night. The laughter did not explode all at once. It spread slowly around the table, like a spark touching dry leaves one after another. Someone near the far end let out a louder laugh than before, and then another voice joined in. I watched my son Ryan lean back in his chair, shaking his head with a grin that looked far too similar to the one his father used to wear when he believed he had just delivered the perfect punchline. The chandelier above us cast a warm yellow light over the table, glinting off the silverware and the glass dishes full of mashed potatoes and green beans. And for a strange moment, the whole scene looked like a perfect holiday photograph, except for the way my chest felt tight and hollow at the same time. Daniel raised his glass slightly, as if he was toasting his own joke. "I mean, honestly," he said with a small chuckle, "I figured you might bring a retired doctor or maybe some successful businessman. You always did have high standards once upon a time." A few more people laughed politely. Ryan glanced at Emily, and she smiled back at him, the kind of smile couples share when they think something mildly embarrassing has happened to someone else. My eyes drifted toward Jack because I was afraid of what expression I might find on his face. Anyone else might have looked hurt or defensive or maybe angry. But Jack did none of those things. He simply sat there calmly, his shoulders relaxed, his hands resting beside his plate, listening as if Daniel were discussing the weather instead of talking about him. That quiet composure only seemed to encourage Daniel even more. "Tell me something, Jack," Daniel continued, leaning forward again, clearly enjoying the attention of the entire table now. "How does a man who spends his days pushing a mop end up engaged to my ex-wife?" The question hung in the air long enough that even the people who had not been paying close attention before were now watching closely. I felt the familiar sting behind my eyes, the kind that appears when disappointment cuts deeper than anger. I looked at Ryan again, hoping this time he might step in and say something, anything, to redirect the conversation. Instead, he let out another short laugh and said, "Dad, come on," though his tone suggested he was more entertained than concerned. That sound landed heavier than all the others. There is something uniquely painful about realizing your own children are comfortable laughing while someone you love is being treated like a joke. Daniel shook his head again and waved his hand dismissively toward Jack. "I am serious," he said, raising his voice just enough that everyone could hear clearly. "A janitor? Margaret, you really lowered the bar this time." A louder round of laughter rolled across the table now, and I felt my fingers tighten around the edge of my napkin. For a second I considered standing up and leaving right then. But before I could say anything, Daniel leaned back in his chair, took a sip from his glass, and spoke the words that would freeze the entire room only moments later. He glanced toward Jack with a smirk and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Let us be honest here. The guy is trash." And what hurt the most was not the word itself. It was the sound that followed when several people at the table, including my own son, laughed out loud. For a moment after Daniel said the word, the room filled with laughter again, louder than before. The kind of laughter people make when they think they are witnessing something ridiculous and harmless. I could hear Ryan laughing openly now, not even trying to hide it anymore. And Emily leaned toward him with a smile that suggested the whole situation had turned into an entertaining story they would probably repeat later. The sound of it all wrapped around me like cold air. But what stayed with me the most was the look on Jack's face, because it did not change at all. He did not look embarrassed, and he did not look angry. He simply watched Daniel with the same calm expression he had worn since the conversation began, as if he had expected every word that had just been said. Slowly, he placed his fork down on the plate in front of him. The quiet clink of metal against ceramic was small, but somehow it cut through the laughter enough that a few people glanced toward him again. I felt my heart beating harder in my chest, because I knew Jack well enough by then to recognize that particular calm. It was the kind of calm that appears when someone is completely certain of themselves. Daniel noticed the movement too and leaned forward slightly, still smiling as though he was enjoying a private joke with the entire table. "Oh, come on," he said casually, spreading his hands as if he was simply being honest. "Nobody here is offended, right? We are all just having a little fun. Christmas dinner should have a little humor." A couple of people nodded awkwardly, and someone near the end of the table let out another uncertain chuckle. I turned toward my son again, hoping he might finally step in and redirect the conversation, but Ryan only shrugged lightly, as if to say it was not a big deal. That small gesture told me more than words ever could. It told me that in this room, tonight, Jack was the easiest person to laugh at. Jack rested his hands calmly on the table and looked directly at Daniel for the first time since the teasing began. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady, the kind of voice that makes people listen even when they do not expect to. "That is all right," he said simply. "People often misunderstand what they see at first." The room grew slightly quieter after that, not silent, but the laughter faded into murmurs and the scraping of chairs as people shifted their attention back toward the conversation. Daniel raised an eyebrow with exaggerated curiosity. "Is that so?" he replied with a grin. "Well then, help us understand." Jack nodded once, as if he had been waiting for that exact response. He folded his napkin neatly beside his plate and looked around the table for a brief second before returning his attention to Daniel. "Let me ask you something first," he said calmly. Daniel leaned back again, clearly amused that the janitor had decided to respond with a question. "All right," Daniel said with a smirk. "Go ahead." Jack held his gaze and asked in the same steady voice, "Have you ever heard of a company called Bennett Facility Group?" The name settled over the table quietly, and for the first time that night Daniel's smile paused just long enough that I noticed it. Daniel did not answer immediately. The question seemed simple, but something about the name Jack had just mentioned caused a small shift in the atmosphere around the table. Daniel blinked once and tilted his head slightly, as if searching his memory. Around us, the quiet holiday music playing in the living room suddenly felt louder because no one else was speaking. Ryan glanced from Jack to his father with mild curiosity, clearly expecting Daniel to brush the question aside with another joke. Daniel gave a short laugh, though this time it sounded a little thinner than before. Bennett Facility Group, he repeated slowly. Cannot say that I have. Jack nodded politely as if the answer did not surprise him at all. That is all right, he said in the same calm tone. Most people have heard of the buildings we maintain long before they hear the name. Daniel raised his glass again, but this time he did not drink right away. And what exactly is that supposed to mean? He asked, still trying to keep the playful edge in his voice. Jack rested his forearms lightly on the table. It is a facilities management company, he explained. Maintenance, cleaning, safety inspections, renovation coordination. We handle contracts for schools, hospitals, and several municipal buildings across the state. A couple of people at the table exchanged quick glances, though no one spoke yet. Daniel smirked again as if he had found a new angle for his amusement. Well, that sounds impressive, he said lightly. But I still do not see what that has to do with pushing a mop at a high school. Jack's small smile returned, patient and steady. Westbrook High School is one of our contracts, he replied. I spend time there personally from time to time. Ryan frowned slightly, leaning forward a bit. Wait, he said slowly, Westbrook High School. Jack turned his head toward him and nodded. Yes. Ryan shifted in his chair, glancing briefly at Emily before speaking again. That is the school district where Tyler goes next year. Jack nodded again. I am aware. We maintain 3 schools in that district. The table had grown noticeably quieter now. Daniel set his glass down with a faint clink. So you are saying you work for this company, he said, emphasizing the word work as if it still supported his earlier joke. Jack looked directly at him and answered gently. I did not say I worked for them. Daniel frowned slightly, confusion slipping through the confidence he had worn all evening. Then what exactly are you saying? Jack paused for just a second, long enough that every pair of eyes around the table drifted toward him again. His voice remained calm, almost conversational. I started the company 27 years ago, he said. Bennett Facility Group is mine. The sentence settled over the dining room like the sudden hush after a loud bell stops ringing. No one laughed this time. Ryan's chair creaked softly as he leaned back, staring at Jack with a completely different expression than before. Emily's smile had disappeared. Daniel looked at Jack for a long moment, the confident smirk from earlier fading into something far less certain as the meaning of those quiet words began to sink in. For several seconds no one spoke. The quiet that followed Jack's words felt completely different from the earlier silence that had been filled with laughter. This time it was the kind of silence people fall into when they realize the ground under their assumptions has suddenly shifted. Daniel blinked slowly, as if he had not heard correctly. His eyes moved from Jack to me and then back again, searching for some sign that this was a joke meant to embarrass him in return. But Jack's expression remained calm and steady, the same patient smile resting on his face. Daniel cleared his throat and leaned back in his chair, attempting to recover the confident tone he had carried earlier. You started the company, he repeated carefully. That is what you were saying. Jack nodded once. Yes. The word was simple, almost quiet, but it seemed to echo around the table louder than any of Daniel's jokes had. Ryan shifted in his chair again and rubbed the back of his neck. Bennett Facility Group, he said slowly, as if he was testing the name out loud. I think I have seen that on some trucks around town. Jack gave a small nod. We operate throughout most of the state now, he replied. About 200 employees at the moment. The number seemed to land heavily in the room. Emily glanced quickly at Ryan, her earlier amusement completely gone. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around the glass in his hand, though he quickly set it back down on the table. 200 employees, he repeated with a forced chuckle. That is quite something for a janitor. Jack did not react to the sarcasm. Every company starts somewhere, he said calmly. 27 years ago, it was just me, a pickup truck, and a few cleaning contracts for small offices. I still like to visit some of our sites myself. It reminds me where everything began. Ryan leaned forward a little now, curiosity replacing the earlier laughter on his face. So you actually own the whole company? He asked. Jack nodded again. Yes. He paused briefly before adding. The headquarters is about 15 miles from here. Daniel's smile had faded completely. The easy confidence he had worn earlier was gone, replaced by a look that suggested he was quickly reconsidering every joke he had made in the past few minutes. Around the table, people avoided looking directly at one another. A fork scraped lightly against a plate as someone shifted uncomfortably. I sat there watching all of it unfold, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and clarity. Jack had not raised his voice or tried to humiliate anyone in return. He had simply answered the question that Daniel himself had asked. Daniel finally leaned forward again, though this time his posture was far less relaxed. "If that is true," he said slowly, "why in the world would you still be working as a janitor in a high school?" Jack looked at him for a moment and then gave a gentle shrug. "Because I like the work," he said, "and because there is something honest about taking care of a place that thousands of students walk through every day." His voice remained calm, but the words carried a quiet weight that made the earlier laughter feel very far away. Daniel did not laugh this time. In fact, no one at the table laughed anymore. The room had become so quiet that I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the faint holiday music still drifting in from the living room. Just a few minutes earlier, everyone had been relaxed and amused, but now people sat straighter in their chairs, suddenly very aware of the words they had chosen before. Ryan rubbed his hands together slowly as if trying to process everything he had just heard. 200 employees, he repeated again under his breath. Emily glanced at him, then at Jack, her expression carefully neutral now. Daniel cleared his throat and forced a small smile, though it looked nothing like the confident smirk he had worn earlier. "Well," he said, adjusting his posture as if trying to regain control of the conversation, "that certainly explains a few things." But the truth was obvious to everyone in the room. Nothing about the evening had gone the way Daniel expected. Jack had not argued. He had not tried to defend his dignity in a loud or dramatic way. He had simply answered questions calmly until the truth spoke for itself. Ryan leaned forward again, resting his elbows lightly on the table. "So your company maintains Westbrook High School?" he asked. Jack nodded. "Yes, along with 2 other schools in the district." Ryan blinked and glanced at Emily. "That means you probably know the superintendent," he said slowly. Jack gave a small nod. "We work with the district administration regularly." Ryan let out a quiet breath, and I could almost see the realization forming in his mind as he connected pieces that had not mattered to him before. Daniel shifted again in his chair and picked up his glass, though he did not drink from it. "You know," he said with a careful tone, "most people would probably lead with that information when someone asks what they do." Jack smiled slightly, but there was no arrogance in it. "Most people do not ask many questions. After they hear the word janitor," he replied gently. That single sentence seemed to settle heavily over the table. No one had a quick response for it. Emily reached for her glass of water, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Ryan stared at the tablecloth for a moment, his earlier laughter now replaced by an awkward silence. Daniel finally set his glass down again and exhaled slowly. "Well," he said, attempting another smile that looked more strained than confident, "I suppose we may have misunderstood things a bit earlier." Jack nodded politely, but did not comment. He simply sat there with the same steady composure he had carried since the beginning of the evening. I watched Daniel's face carefully then, because I knew him well enough to recognize the moment when pride and discomfort begin fighting for space in a man's mind. For the first time that night, Daniel looked less like the host of the joke and more like someone realizing he might have been the punchline all along. And around the table, one by one, people began to understand that the man they had laughed at only minutes earlier had never been the smallest person in the room.